Enough to do these guys. So I want to bring out the real artists that are here. We have Carl Potts, who created Alien Legion, and also was a major editor at Marvel for years. Carl? Get him over here. Give me a second. Carl. All right. He created Alien Legion. He was a major editor at Marvel for years. He's an artist who worked with Punisher, the New Mutants, X-Men, Doctor Strange, many, many others. You join us right there. We have Brandon Peterson, who worked with Marvel, DC, created Age of Ultron, worked at Image for many years as well. And then James Robar, creator of The Crow. All right, so I'm going to ask these guys some questions about being professional creators, but I'd also like to get questions from you guys. However, to do that, I probably need you to come up right about here. If you guys can scoot over one seat, would that be all right? Yeah. And then if you come up here, I'll bring the mic to you and ask you guys to ask your questions. All right. So yeah, whenever, go ahead and start lining up. As soon as you get a chance, I'm going to go around real quick and ask each of them to introduce, and then we'll come back.
Now, these seats are not people friendly at all.
Very small, like airline seats.
Oh God! That's one of the reasons why I hate flying.
And this is called a professional artist panel, but you are one of those examples of indie breakouts from the 80s and 90s that where people just immediately found out who you were and what your work was, and it became world famous. So what I want to ask is,
sold over 1 million copies, 15, 16 different languages, and it still sells well to this day. So I did something right.
Exactly. What I was going to ask as well, how did that feel going from, hey, I made this because I wanted it, to everybody wants you to make it?
It was very surreal.
You're right.
I mean, I did comics because I wanted to interact with people vicariously, you know, and then suddenly I'm in the spotlight. They got the #1 movie in the U.S. So it was a big change for me. Not always pleasant.
That's fair. Although I will say that your work has made a big impression on a lot of people. And Brandon, you are currently working with Marvel and DC a lot, and you've worked for years with all the big companies, actually. And I was just talking to you a second ago, you mentioned Age of Ultron was one of the big books you worked on that became the title of a big major blockbuster in the MCU. What has life been like for you as a professional artist?
You know, honestly, I've been really lucky since the early 90s. I've been able to get work, you know, Marvel first of all, then Image for a long time, then Marvel again, and just recently DC. I was just thinking about, you were talking about the Age of Ultron movie. Unlike James, I was doing work for hire, so while that was very popular, I did not see one nickel more than what I got paid for drawing the pages. So it's, hold on.
I'm one of the few people.
That's all right.
You get it in a minute.
Yeah.
I didn't sell my character.
Yeah.
I got paid every single time.
That's the difference between working for Marvel and DC. DC's a little better, I will admit. I have friends like Chuck Dixon who created Bane for the Batman comics, and after the movie came out with Bane, I kind of came up and I said, "Did they do okay?" And he goes, "DC actually gave him a 6-figure check for that movie." And
A token check not to sue them?
Yeah, exactly. But it's better than what Marvel does, which is, stop asking us. Oh, that's true. They'll give you a $5,000 check.
On that note, Neil Adams, who passed away recently, he had said in an interview that when he created a character that showed up in a DC movie, they just sent him a big check. And when he created a character that showed up in a Marvel movie, he got a special thanks at the end. And he said that tells you the difference between the two. Mr. Potts, Carl, now you have worked on both sides of this, where in terms of like the behind the editorial and in front on the page. What has your perspective been like as seeing both what it's like to be the artist and also to be the people working with the artists?
I think being a professional artist and writer helped me be a better editor because I knew what it was like on both sides of the desk. I knew what was expected, and I could also help out the freelance creators if they ran into trouble because I knew the restrictions that were in place and the tricks of the trade to fixing things, getting them on time. So and also I was on both sides of this whole creator-owned, company-owned thing too. I worked on a lot of company-owned titles, and also Marvel had its own creator-owned imprint for a long time called Epic Comics, which is where I created Alien Legion, so I retained the rights for that. So it's just a matter of whatever you feel like doing with your character. There's certain benefits of creating a character that the company owns, as long as you have a new character agreement that guarantees you a certain percentage of the back end that you're happy with. And then if you retain all the rights, then you can make whatever deal you want with your character down the road.
On that note, there's been kind of an evolution of ownership, not ownership, sorry, royalties would be a better way. Royalties over the years of what this has meant. And in terms of ownership, I think both Marvel and DC have at different times played with allowing creator-owned things to be published, sometimes even having to interact with the main characters. I don't think Marvel's doing that now since Disney took over, and I don't think DC's currently.
I don't believe so.
I think there might be an imprint. I know, like the Empire book that Stuart Immonen drew. The writer was Mark Miller, I think, and that was through their self-publishing. It's not something that they use a ton of.
It's not like Epic before, where they were trying to get on all the same. I was going to say shelves, but all the same comic book stores.
Yeah, and I don't know if DC has something like that.
And then as far as royalties go, a lot of stuff, like for example, Blade was created in the 70s. So there wasn't a royalty agreement necessarily for something being adapted. Let's say Deadpool, created in the 90s, there is a royalty agreement. So it has changed over the years.
It's sort of a legal term thing. I was told anyway that if it's a company-owned project and you're receiving money for having worked on it, it's an incentive. Whereas if you own the property, then it's a royalty.
He's 100% right. Yeah, it's the term. Incentive is a voluntary sort of thing, while royalty implies ownership.
All right, let me get some questions real quick, and we'll come back. If you want to come over here, I'm going to get the questions about that.
What would you say is your favorite part of the process of creating a comic, and what would you say is the hardest part for you?
So, what is your favorite part when it comes to making a comic, and at the same time, what is the most difficult or hardest part of making a comic? James, you want to start with you?
My favorite part is, the actual creation of it, sitting down at a drawing board. I don't do anything digital, so everything is ink on paper. I even do my own lettering still. And it's, you get to play God. I'm the director. I get to pick the actors. So it's, I really enjoy that part of it. And going out and selling it, playing used car salesman, that's the love for it. And everyone that comes up to your table, you have to explain it to them all over again with enthusiasm.
Is there a difference between trying to explain it to somebody at the table versus trying to explain it to somebody at a boardroom?
Well, I've never worked for Marvel or DC other than some covers and things. So
Well, I mean, like
the boardroom I had to work with was Hollywood.
That's what I was referring to,
It was, no, I think there's a fair amount of imbeciles in both of them.
Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, the actual making it's the fun part. I always tell people, I've worked in sort of an editorial capacity as an art director for a publisher and various other times, and I had opportunities to continue along that, but I always chose the creative part. And people always go, well, why? I mean, there's more regular work, and you get medical and stuff like that if you And I said, yeah, but it's not. I didn't grow up wanting to tell people, and help them make comics. I wanted to make them. You know what I mean? In a sense. And so the actual physical art of drawing is always the fun part, you know. The parts that I like less is like the business side. It's the, you know, chasing down a publisher who owes you money. That's never fun. Or, you know, like dealing with all the, you know, the various things like scheduling, like, okay, I've got 3 jobs this month, so I have to choose one of them, but then the next month I don't have anything, so what am I going to do? You know, that it's sort of feast or famine a lot of times, which isn't fun. That's pretty typical for freelance. And but the people I've worked with have always been really great from editorial. I can't think of there's maybe 1 or 2 people that you're like, you know, that didn't work out great. But almost always it's people that are enthusiastic about doing the work and they want to just make the best work possible with the constraints that they're given, you know. Like I said, there's some distasteful things, but it's almost always on the business side. Like going to a convention's great. People always go, oh, don't you get tired? I go, I just sit at a table and people come up to me and say they like what I do. I mean, it's really hard not to pretty much feel good about it at the end of the day, you know. I mean, if you hate my stuff, you're not going to wait in a line and tell me that, I hope. But don't do that if you do. That's a bad idea. But overall, you know, like talking to other professionals and talking to fans and stuff, it's the best part, you know. Get the enthusiasm. Like people really like, you know, what you do and like you like doing it.
Carl?
When it comes to the actual creation of a comic, I really get jazzed when the original ideas are coming to me and I'm putting them together and it seems to be coalescing into something that really feels like it has potential. And then I like it when it's all done and it's come out. There's some parts in between there that are a lot of hard work and it's like, I like having done the work more than sometimes I like doing the work. But when I was on staff at Marvel as an editor, I got to wear many hats. And I also wrote and drew at night when I should have been sleeping for them. And so I got to do it all. And it was a brilliant period when I got to do all that stuff and I had the energy to maintain that through extended periods of time.
I think the stereotype is that the artist does not sleep at night. Is this accurate? Thank you very much. All right, next.
So there have been recent comic book based shows and stuff like The Boys or Invincible. What would you say, like, could a young artist create the next Spider-Man, Superman, etc. without any of the, like, the gore or shock value of Invincible or The Boys? I'm not saying those aren't good, but you know.
Right, so a lot of the recent hits that have been out in the general public, and by that I mean beyond the comic reading public, although maybe including them, have involved a lot of R-rated superheroes, you know? Is there still room for superheroes that aren't literally pulling somebody's guts out? Is that something that could be done today that could still become successful? Carl?
I sure hope so. I think, you know, people confuse subject matter and genres with the actual art form, and that gets confusing. For the longest time, if you said something was based on a comic, people would assume it was going to be a superhero thing, and you talk to them and they'd never know that, you know, what was the Tom Hanks film?
Road to Perdition?
Yeah, Road to Perdition was built on a graphic novel. But nowadays, you know, that's the knowledge along those lines has gotten wider. But I just think that, you know, there's enough room, as there is in comics, for everything from stuff aimed at toddlers to adults. And when you get to the adults, it can be just fun stuff. I sometimes look at things like The Boys, which is a very good show, but I just think there's shock for shock's sake sometimes instead of shock for the service of the story. My personal opinion.
I think there's a difference between the shock in The Boys versus the shock in, say, Invincible, where it's meant to have a story beat to it. Brandon, James, either of you have thoughts on that? Are modern...
Well, I mean, my analogy is that, you know, you got to just ask, is there room for records that don't have electric guitars on them? And I say, absolutely. I mean, it's wide open, but you have to find your audience too. You know? And that can be difficult. You know? And I think a problem with a lot of this, not a problem, but is that there's no really young readers anymore. It's just like everybody from my generation that grew up reading comics, they're still reading them. And so now that material is geared towards them. You know, it's geared towards 30-year-olds and, you know, or 30-plus-year-olds. So, yeah, it just didn't foster a new generation of young readers.
Yeah, I mean, what he's saying is true. Like new readers are, and there's some books, like I think Boom is putting out a lot of very kid-oriented books, like Lumberjanes and stuff like that. And I'm seeing a lot of manga and kind of fill in the gaps for a lot of young people. But the idea of going to a bookstore, I don't think a lot of, like Barnes and Nobles and seeing stuff, or going to a comic book store. I think a lot of people are finding stuff online, web comics, things that they like that. So I think the thing, it's the same sort of material, it's just being sort of different vehicles to get it to them. I think the big thing is always going to be for success is doing something that's interesting and compelling is the first thing. It really doesn't matter genre as much, If your characters are interesting and compelling, they can just be sitting around having a pizza and it's interesting to, look at stuff. I think the bigger high concept stuff, that's kind of been extinguished. I think Robert Kirkman showed that when he did Walking Dead, like a zombie comic book and things like that. Some of the most, it's the biggest book in Europe. It's the biggest television show. So I mean, the high concept stuff really for movies and TV still is number one. Like science fiction and fantasy, superheroes, those are the biggest movies of all time. I think
do you think comics exist now solely for vehicles for studios to?
I sure hope not.
Are we just like a commercial or something until they get their next movie out?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like the big high concept stuff like superheroes, science fiction, and fantasy, that's what they're interested in. And The Walking Dead is kind of a miracle in a sense because it was a zombie thing. I think that, I know with like I mentioned Boom, a lot of those are things that are being developed and stuff because I think it's still high concept. It doesn't have to be guys with big muscles beating each other up, which is, kind of what's happened. I think as long as the characters are interesting and you have a good spin, an interesting spin, there's always going to be room if it's well done. I think people respond to quality, more than anything.
The sort of a strange situation that James was alluding to is the fact that when the old spinner rack newsstand market went away, the recruiting tool that comics had for bringing in new readers, including young readers, disappeared. It used to be there were spinner racks in every drugstore, every supermarket, every candy store, newsstand. So almost every day, almost all Americans were exposed to comics, and a certain percentage of them would pick them up, and a certain percentage of them would become fans. They'd find the comic book specialty stores. But when all that went away, all that was left with the specialty stores, and there were a couple thousand of them scattered across the U.S. I'm not sure there are some states that even have it. Does Montana have a comic book specialty store? I don't know. If it does, it's probably sitting 100 miles away from where most of the people live. But and if you ran across a comic book specialty store, odds are it wasn't something that was going to be appealing to kids or their parents. So today, hopefully, that same audience is being slowly, becoming aware of comics through the internet. But the newsstand disappearance was really a big blow for the recruiting system for comics. And the reason that went away is because the profit margin sales for each comic was so low, and they kept having to rack and unrack the new old comics that didn't sell and the new ones that did, that it really wasn't worth their while. So they would replace that same space with like a display for leg stockings or something like that, where they got much bigger profit margin. They just plugged the same thing back in to fill the holes, and that was the end of comics in the newsstand, I'm afraid.
Now, I got hooked on comics through the newsstand. I was going to the gas station every week, looking for news journals for the most part, But Brandon, I think you mentioned it earlier. Webcomics have kind of filled that gap a bit. So it's different. There's the bigger companies trying to get into it, DC especially.
Yeah.
Do you think that has potential to bring those young readers that James was talking about?
Yeah, I know some people, and they're getting hundreds of thousands of views, doing stuff that's online. I think it's the same thing, like I grew up with the media, like I was a kid, like I lived out in the middle of nowhere, but there was a gas station that had comic books. And I remember when my mom and dad would get a fill-up, I'd be like, can you give me that? Can you give me that? It was a lot of Richie Rich when I was young, which was, Harvey was a great introduction into comics.
And they were more affordable.
Oh, yeah,
They
yeah.
were 12 cents.
Yeah, you could get one for
15
a
cents.
quarter, I think, at the most expensive, I remember once trying to get my dad to buy one of those dollar DC digests, and he was like, $1? What are you kidding? And, that's when $1 meant something. And, but I think it's just different now. I think I used to go to record stores and flip through the bins and go and have them put an album on or a CD on, and that's how I found new music. And I used to go to bookstores and comic book stores and kind of flip through and go, oh, look at this. This is something I want. I think, the newsstands are almost completely dead anyway. Like even magazines, like I remember when like Maxim was kicking comics off because the guy could sell it for $8 and took the same space as a $2 comic. So, there you go. That's what we're going to do with it. But even that's gone now, I think it's just the vehicle. When I see a lot of new artists, they're coming up, and stuff like that. They're coming from like the web comics or sort of that online, like Webtoons is a big company, and there's a lot of people doing it themselves. I remember like watching when there was a guy, Texas guy, Scott Kurtz, who was doing PvP, and then what is that? Trying to think of the really Penny Arcade. I remember when that was blowing up, and suddenly they were, big enough to make major conventions for gaming all over the country and stuff like that. So I think it's just changing. And I mean, I know like they say more and more online sales for even the books that I do for Marvel and DC, for Comixology and stuff like that are becoming more and more of a thing. So I hope that's the case. I think the vehicle of pictures to tell a story is still very valid. Especially, you can take your time and digest it as, it isn't just fed to you, so.
Full confession, my weekly comics are bought digitally now. Yeah. All right, thank you so much.
Hey guys, my name is Dusty. I'm a big comic book fan, Punisher, and MCU fan. So I was kind of curious, how did the whole Punisher get into the MCU and how all that started with the whole comic books and all that? I heard it was about Punisher.
Yeah, Carl, I was going to ask you here. So Punisher began as a basically a Spider-Man villain, kind of took off on his own a bit. You were an editor around the time where Punisher was really taking off. What do you think made Punisher go from this kind of niche, almost a parody of comics, to being able to be in movies and had a major show in streaming and that kind of stuff? What was it that allowed Punisher to make that leap?
Well, I think there was at that time anyway something in the ether. There were films like the Dirty Harry films and Death Wish and that sort of thing that I think there was a certain amount of frustration that there was criminal elements that were highly organized that the justice system couldn't really touch. And so it was a fantasy to see, those people being taken out by the Punisher. But the Punisher to me was always a cautionary tale. What happens when you let, your revenge and just cloud your judgment. But he also basically had a death wish. He failed to protect his family from the mob. They got killed. So he keeps going after the mob or similar people, and he knows at some point he'll be maimed or killed and pay the price he should have for failing to protect them. There's been some recent versions of the character that I've seen and things that have happened with him with his popularity that I am very leery of. I've seen some cop cars with Punisher skull on. The last thing I want my police to be associated with is a vigilante. And I don't, I've seen, military use it too. The only military that should ever be associated with the skull are the SS, and I do not want our military being associated with the SS. So I probably get myself in trouble with certain segments of the Punisher fan base by saying that, but he's definitely not someone to be admired or emulated. He's a cautionary tale.
He's not a hero.
Yeah.
In the Marvel Comics recently, they actually had, I say recently, about 5-10 years ago, they actually had Punisher confront cops who had his symbol on their car.
Oh, yeah?
and get angry at them, like, why are you doing this? We're not on the same side. And then you mentioned Netflix, the series is going to be partially MCU now, maybe.
Yeah.
And in that version, that was a Frank Castle, more so than Punisher, who was dealing with PTSD. I was describing it to people as being a toned-down version of Punisher in order for him to be the protagonist of a series that we could actually follow. This is a Punisher that actually won't shoot somebody who's a little kid who got involved in a gang, as opposed to the comic one who's like, you're in a gang, you get shot. So do you think that those evolutions have helped the characters stay? Like you said, when you were an editor there, and when you were drawing Punisher, he was that power fantasy, and now it's become more of an acknowledgement of the reality behind that.
I guess, but I still think they did stuff on the show that I wouldn't have allowed if I was editing the book. Like, they had him running through a hospital with a shotgun blasting away. There's no way the version I wrote would have done that. And
That was the first thing I thought of too, the hospital scene.
And then there's a scene where he's on the rooftop, he's got Daredevil bound up and he's questioning him. And the superintendent of the building is trying to get up on the roof, and Frank Castle's on the other side of the door with his gun drawn, ready to kill the guy if he insists on coming through the door. And the only reason he doesn't kill him is because he finds out that the superintendent was once a Marine too, and that makes no sense to me. If that's the only reason you're not going to kill the superintendent for doing his job, to check out this ruckus on the roof, that just makes no sense.
That hospital scene, as much as I would say that about a lot of the Punisher stuff in MCU, or Netflix, I guess, that hospital scene, he just literally just shot, and I'm like, All right, any other questions that we're going to ask about this? All right, if you have any questions, come on up here and we'll get to you. One thing I want to ask you guys about, we already talked a little bit about royalties and ownership. What is it like working as part of a larger industry? James, for you, you have control of your own character.
I do.
But whenever your character was brought into a new medium, then you are dealing with other hands in the pot, so to speak. What was it like dealing with those other people on the outside?
I was very fortunate that I kept complete control of all the publication rights and things, and so when they wanted to do some spin-offs or side stories, I took people I wanted to work with. People that I thought could do a good job, or people that I admired. So I've kept pretty tight control over it over the years. So it's not exactly what I would have done, but it's a viable vision.
Brandon, a different aspect of that, being an artist working for the big companies, how much leeway do you have? Is it difficult working? Let me phrase difficult. What is a relationship like working with, say, an artist? A writer, or say working with a writer and an editor, or maybe an editor and a team of editors sometimes?
I've had. There's a lot of variety in that. There's no standard way to do it. When I first started at Marvel, I think editorial was much more involved, and the writer was. I would get plots. Now, when I draw from is
Just for clarity, this is like X-Men in the 90s.
X-Men in the 90s.
That was
Sorry,
famous
this
for
is
having
a
strong
long
editorial
time
control.
ago. Yeah.
And there's a difference between the way Marvel and DC,
Used less now. It's changed. Yeah. So what I got is what was called a plot, and it didn't have
it's on a
to.
napkin.
I'll tell you the difference, okay, of what I've had from writers. I've had writers that would say pages 5 through 10, the X-Men fight the villains, the X-Men win. That was all I had. So I broke it down. I figured out where the fight scene beats were going to be. I figured out how many panels. I figured out all that stuff. And then I worked with Alan Moore.
Yeah.
And Alan Moore gave me one single space type page to describe every panel in the story, where he wanted every mote of dust, every leaf of the plant describing how much it was wilting. I mean, just crazy level of detail. Most people fall in between there somewhere. Nowadays, you get what it looks like more like a film script. It'll be broken down into panels, and there'll be some sample dialogue and some sound information of what they want to convey. This is what's happening in the panel. This is what the people are saying. But the thing is, there's a huge amount of autonomy I get nowadays. I think it might possibly be just because of how much work an editor has going across their desk, how little they can how much they have to trust the people they're working with are going to be able to handle it. Like, I'm often looking up my own things like I never did before, like looking at my own reference, communicating with the writer, making sure I get specific things, because I know my editor's swamped. I know that he's got 6 books going out that week or something crazy like that. So how's he going to answer my question about panel 3? You know what I mean? So it's, and I think that's the thing with a guy like me. I've been doing this for decades now. They know what they're going to get with me. I think that's what they, you know,
Yeah,
part of what they
me as well. It's like, you want moody, dark, depressing, and violent, just get over her.
Yeah. The one thing you have when you're, as opposed to starting out, when you've been doing this, is your rep. Your reputation is how I get more jobs and how I, you know,
What we're good at.
yeah, are my strengths.
Just speaking for you personally as an artist, your own personal art, would you prefer to have that Marvel method where they just kind of like say, hey, for 5 pages this happens? Or would you prefer to have more detail so there's less back-end corrections?
It honestly depends on the writer, and I'm going to say that because there's some writers that have such a specific thing they're trying to convey. Give me more detail. If you're feeling
Do you have some examples?
let me think here. Right now I'm working on Superman. And it's with a guy who's a relatively new writer, and I don't know his work that strong, so I don't know what he's trying to push forward. So the editor is pretty busy, but you know, the email chains you get, you can always just see his email. So I contacted him, and he's like, hey, how much do you need from me, and how much can I give you? And I go, for fight scenes, honestly, could you keep the I always think it's weird when people are having whole conversations during a fight scene, like,
Right.
You're like my brother who was born 5 years ago in the heart of the sun, and you're like, it should be like, oh, ow, ooh, you know what I mean? Like, it shouldn't be these diatribes. And he goes, okay, great. And I said, but when you have those things, really tell me what they're saying, because I can really match the facial expression to what you're trying to convey, the last beat. If it's a downbeat, I can make it a down face. Or if it's an upbeat, I can make it an up face. You know, I've really been depressed, but I'm feeling better. But I'm feeling better is really important if you want to get the facial expression right. Because if I just get, I'm feeling depressed, he's going to look like, gross, you know? So it's what the writer's trying to convey is probably the biggest thing. And I think that's what, a lot of times if it's choreographing action, you can give me a little bit more room. And I think if you really are, it's about the dialogue and the information you're trying to convey, then give me more so that I can make sure it's specific, you know?
Now, James really is his own team, and then Brandon was talking about being part of a team. But Carl, you've had a lot of experience running teams. So what is the key to that, to getting everybody to work together in terms of the levels between writer, artist, editor? What is the key to getting that?
So I had the benefit of it. The period I was at Marvel, editors virtually had total control of who to hire for their books. So based on the type of work a writer did and what they enjoyed, and also how professional they were, I did not like hiring people I'd keep having to hound to get their work in on time. So I wanted people that, you know, were professionally reliable as well. So I got very lucky with, I inherited a batch of books from the previous editor that I replaced, and they had pretty reliable writers in all of them. And then I started getting to work with Louise Simonson at the start of her writing career, and she was just a total dream to work with. The books came in on time, the plots would come in, and I'd read them, and I have this big smile on my face, and I hand it off to the artist. Occasionally you need to fix things here and there. One of the things with Marvel is there was a lot of crossovers between characters, so you had a character in your book that was under the supervision of a different editor. You had to give that editor the plot to approve, and then they had to see the finished book to approve. And sometimes that could create some issues with differences in how everybody saw the characters. we were talking about the Punisher before. Half the planet wanted to cross over with the Punisher, and most of these people that were getting ideas about the character were really going to extremes that I thought were, a cheap way out. It's like he shoots criminals, so let's have him go nuts and shoot jaywalkers and litterbugs. And then they'd not be amused when I killed that plot. So there was a little bit of that, but most of the people, knew the characters well enough so that they didn't go to those extremes.
Well, thank you very much. Let me get another question over here.
What was your inspiration? What inspired you to create comics in the first place?
James, I'd like to start with you with that one.
I love to tell a story. To me, I feel like I'm making my own movies, but I don't have to do any of the compromises that you have to make when you're actually making films. And I have 110% control over everything. And I don't have to explain to anyone what I want, or what motivations are, or why I picked this camera angle. So it's like I love to tell stories. I think of them as little films. And honestly, I just don't play well with others. I have a really singular vision. And it's easier for me to do it myself than to explain or give examples to someone else. So, but yeah, it all comes down to story.
What made you want to put together and publish that first comic?
Mental health issues. It was. I wanted to reach some people that were like me, because I knew there were other people out there who liked the same kind of music I liked, who liked the same films, the same themes I like to play with. But back then, before the internet, how did you find those people? And honestly, it wasn't even comic stores. It was like I found those people through record stores. Record stores started carrying the Crow because of all the music references in it. And then that just kind of broke wide open for me.
Brandon, why did you want to make comics?
I mean, it's pretty generic. If you talk to artists, I like to draw, and I grew up a farm kid in the middle of Wisconsin, so comics weren't my first experience. It was Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. But I always loved high concept stuff, which means high concept, just to clarify, means things that are not based necessarily in reality. It's more imaginative stuff. And so I kind of grew up, and I read comics and stuff, but it wasn't until junior high that I was able to see friends every day and they'd let me read their comics. And I was able to maybe sneak away and go to the comic book store that was nearby, and buy some comics with my lawn mowing money, things like that. And I loved it. I loved the fact that I could follow this creative team, and I knew who they were, and I could see the similarities of how one writer would write one book and another book. And that's something you're talking about. The idea that you're a soloist, but in a lot of ways a comic book is like a 3-piece or a 4-piece. You know what I mean? It's a bunch. It's like you can love John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but you can also love the Beatles.
I'm more of a Trent Reznor type.
Yeah, true. Yeah. So you're working with yourself in the studio. Yeah. But yeah, it's the idea of kind of telling stories, I think, is what's appealing to everybody. And like he says, I love the fact that when I look at it, it's me. I feel a real personal connection with everything I do.
Nothing happens on that page by accident.
Yeah.
Every single line is thought about, even what's in the background that people don't even look at. The type of buildings, the cars, the year of the cars, everything about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't just appear. There's not zip-a-tone rub-off.
And then you can linger on it. If you wanted to sit there and study the background, you can see all that.
That's one thing I really miss about new comics is there are no silent moments at all. Every panel has at least one word caption in it. They don't give you time to breathe.
Yeah, it's the difference between a movie or a video game and stuff like that. You're basically being fed the pace. The filmmaker or the video game guy is kind of showing it to you. And because of the amount of work involved, there's hundreds of people. Like if you ever sit and watch the end of a Marvel movie, look at the credits. You know, it's more people than what probably my university, you know, my graduating class scroll by on the screen there. And that's the thing about a comic book. It's got a little blurb in the front or the back usually, and even on the cover, and it's 3 or 4 names, you know. And you can tell, you know, you can see like, oh, I love Adam Hughes. He's this great artist because he draws these, you know, incredible women or these really expressive people or something. I love, you know, like, you know, another, you know, this certain writer or this certain colorist or something like that. It's really unlike even animation or video games or movies. You really are just like a small band.
And Carl, what made you want to get into comics?
I think it's just pretty much along the same lines. I always was reading them when I was growing up. I was fortunate enough to have parents that thought that anything that would get me reading was good to have. It wasn't that long after the whole Wortham and Comics Code fiasco where they said comics were causing the juvenile delinquency in the United States.
Wow, you're that old?
Yes.
Did you become a delinquent?
Not to my knowledge, but I'm subjective in that judgment. So, so I learned to read by the comics, and then, you know, if I was home sick from elementary school, my mom would go to the drugstore and, you know, get aspirin and go by the spinner rack and bring back a bunch of comics for me. She didn't have my taste, so she'd bring back like Lucille Ball comics, and you know, I wanted the DC War books,
yeah, those are great.
and then, so when I started, you know, mowing lawns and all that, I would get that money and run down and buy comics and candy bars, and that was what I looked forward to on the weekends. But I just always loved visual storytelling, whether it was Saturday morning cartoons or comics or going to the movies, and it just seemed that always drew me to it one way or the other, visual storytelling in one form or another.
Now,
Was there a specific team that you look, you know,
like a creative team?
like Stanley and Kirby?
Or Kubert and War Comics?
Ditko was my first big influence. I spotted my first Marvel comic at the PX with my father, and there was Sergeant Fury #1 there, which I'd been reading all the DC War books, which are all these very polished artists. And then there's No, this would have been Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. Yeah, that's how old I am. And so, and the Kirby stuff was like...
Was it Chickstone? Just throwing out some really obscure names there.
But it was, if it was ink, it was probably Dick Ayers ink in it.
I was going to say Dick Ayers around that time, yeah.
So, but it was like, the art style itself, to me, looked ugly. But I kept finding myself going back to the drawer, taking it out every day, looking. It wasn't until I was older I realized it was the dynamics and the storytelling that had me hooked, not the art style. But then I saw the house ads for the other Marvel books, including Spider-Man. I saw that and I was just hooked. And to this day, when I'm doing my rusts, they look almost like Ditko rusts.
I have one last quick question, and that is, anybody up here who wants to become an artist and work in comics and have any measure of personal success, what would you recommend they do? And Carl, I want to start with you real quick. Just
Go back to school.
Marry someone with a steady job.
Find a doctor or a lawyer.
And it's a dying industry. We're all sitting here in denial, but will comics even exist in 30 years other than like a little obscure niche item? I don't know.
It's might be like vinyl now.
Yeah, it might have a vinyl come back, yeah. But that's for nostalgia's sake.
I mean, vinyl went to streaming, so print goes to webcomics?
That's what I see. I mean, if you ask the comic fan, they're probably listing websites they like, you know, more than, you know, going to stores. And I mean, I think they're the physicality and the being able to own it and kind of linger, I think is appealing to someone like me. But there is.
Do you think that's a holdover from our generation where I want a book to hold?
I still have friends that only buy like DVDs and Blu-rays. They don't want to stream, you know. So
That's me. That's me.
Yeah.
I'm that guy. So I will buy my comics digital now, but my movies on Blu-ray and DVD. But that's because I had upwards of 30,000 comics at my house, whereas having, 1,000 DVDs doesn't take as much space.
But I will say, like, come on. There's sometimes I'll sit there and I have Netflix, and I know I have what I want to watch downstairs, but it's so quick to just type it in and look at it on my computer while I'm working or something. So,
I think to a certain degree we are in denial about it, but they'll always exist in some form. When music first started going digital, DVDs replaced LPs, but at least they were still big enough to have cover art and all of that experience, like the booklets, which were all part of the big experience. I managed a large warehouse record store in California for years before I tried to get into comics, and there was just the whole concept of dealing with the LPs and the story they told as a unit, and the total packaging was pretty neat. But now my kids got into it, and they would want to buy individual songs out of context of the lineup of what it was on the total album, and that's the way it is now. And I didn't think I would ever catch on, but now it's the norm.
So the too long didn't read answer: marry someone rich.
Nice to have the physical copy to get because it's more nostalgic.
If you want a career in comics, you have to absolutely, really, really love it and be obsessed by it.
Yeah. There's much easier ways to make money.
Yeah. Do it for the love.
Yeah, you have to.
It's not much pay. There's no glamour. This is the glamorous part for us. No drugs and groupies. This is it.
Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is, it's for lifestyle. You spend a lot of time by yourself, hunched over, and kind of going through this internal monologue of that's good, that's bad, change it.
What have I done with my life?
and yes, you bemoan your fate a little. That's always part of the process. But
You have to love doing visual storytelling to make it worthwhile. If you don't truly love it, don't do it.
Yeah, it's a lot of long hours by yourself, kind of a lot of self-doubt and a self-evaluation going on.
Did you go to school?
Yeah, I did. I have a BFA in graphic arts, so I did that as my, just in case I don't get into comics, I can at least do ad work or something and still kind of do what I want. But luckily I was able to get in right away. It was a different time though. I got in the very early 90s, which I think both people will say, it was the biggest boom time comics will ever see.
It was a golden age.
Yeah.
And I think we have the Turtles guys to thank for that. They broke it wide open.
Yeah,
you didn't have to work for Marvel or DC. You could do your own book. It could be black and white.
The reason I worked for Marvel was because all the top artists left to form Image, and I was right there to fill the void, so.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brandon Peterson.
And thank you all for coming out.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
These guys have booths, go check out their table.